He beat the greatest darts player who ever lived before he'd even turned professional, and then he nearly lost everything, including, by his own words, his will to keep living. This is Corey Cadby's story, and what happened to him after the cameras stopped rolling is something almost no darts fan actually knows. Start with who he actually is, because a lot of the online chatter gets this wrong. Corey Cadby is Australian, born in Devonport on the north coast of Tasmania, and darts wasn't something he grew up around his whole life. He picked it up at 16. In his own words, given to PDC.TV back in 2016, he had only practiced for 3 or 4 months before realising he could actually compete nationally, and not long after that, he packed up and moved from Tasmania to Melbourne to chase it properly. Think about that timeline for a second, because it matters for everything that follows. Most of the players he'd soon be sharing a stage with had been throwing since childhood, grinding through decades of local leagues before they ever sniffed a professional oche. Cadby compressed all of that into a handful of years, and that speed, that raw natural ability arriving almost fully formed, became both the thing that made him famous and, arguably, the thing he was never quite prepared for. The King, that's what they called him, and unlike a lot of walk-on names invented for television, this one came from family. Cadby explained it himself in that same 2016 interview. "My uncle, when I was a little baby, he always marched around like I was a king, so he called me the King. The name stuck, and so did the game. It's a small detail, but it tells you something about how this all started, not as a marketing exercise, not as a manufactured persona, but as a kid from Tasmania who happened to be frighteningly good at throwing tungsten at a board." 2016 turned into one of the most explosive breakout years Australian darts had seen, with Cadby, still in his early 20s, winning 7 Dart Players Australia titles and topping the national rankings. 7 titles in a single season, from a player barely anyone outside Australia had heard of. And that kind of dominance doesn't stay a local secret for long. Then came the result that put him on the map internationally. August 2016, the Sydney Masters. Cadby faced Phil Taylor, arguably the greatest darts player who has ever lived, 16 world titles to his name, and lost 6-3. For most young players that's the story, a respectable loss to a legend, a nice line for the scrapbook. Here's the thing though, Cadby didn't treat it as an honour, he treated it as a problem to be solved. He went home and studied footage of that loss on YouTube, breaking down exactly what went wrong, picking apart his own game frame by frame, and 1 week later, at the Perth Masters, he faced Taylor again. This time the result flipped, 6-2 his way, and that made him the first man ever to beat Phil Taylor on Australian soil. Sit with how remarkable that is. A player who had only taken the sport seriously a few years earlier, dissecting the greatest of all time on video, and then actually beating him in a rematch 7 days later. That's not just talent, that's a competitive mind that most people never develop. That same year, he added the PDC World Youth Championship to his resume, beating Barry Van Peer 6-2 in the final after knocking out Dimitri Van den Berg in the semis. Van den Berg, remember, would go on to become a world champion himself, so this wasn't a soft field, beating the greatest player in the sport's history and becoming a world youth champion in the same 12 months for someone who'd only picked up a dart 6 years earlier. That's about as fast a rise as this sport had seen. The darts world had found its next big thing and everyone knew it. December 2016 brought his PDC World Championship debut at Alexandra Palace, the biggest stage the sport has, the one every player dreams about walking out onto. Cadby won his preliminary round match against Sun Chang before losing in the first round proper to Joe Cullen. A first round exit sounds modest, but here's the detail that lands differently in hindsight. That debut at Ali Pali remains his only appearance at the World Championship to this day. For a talent that big, that was supposed to be the first of many, it became the only one. Cadby actually skipped Q School in early 2017, choosing to stay outside the full professional tour a little longer, and looking back, that decision is an early hint at the pattern that would define his career. The sense that the conventional path, the grind everyone else accepted, was something he could take or leave. His form kept building anyway. Auckland Darts Masters, mid-2017, he beat Peter Wright, he beat Gerwyn Price, and he beat Phil Taylor again, 3 of the biggest names in the sport in a single tournament, before losing the final to fellow Australian Kyle Anderson. That name, Kyle Anderson, is worth holding on to, because Anderson was more than just an opponent that night. He was a mentor and a stablemate, another Australian trying to make it in a sport run out of the other side of the world, and the two of them represented what Australian darts could be. January 2018 changed things. That's when Cadby finally entered Q School and won a full PDC Tour card, and almost immediately he delivered one of the biggest results of his career. A UK Open qualifier in February 2018 saw him beat reigning world champion Rob Cross, the man who just dethroned Phil Taylor at Ali Pali, and that run carried him all the way to the final of the 2018 UK Open itself, one of the sport's genuine majors, where he lost to Gary Anderson. Around the same stretch, he also reached a Players' Championship final, dropping that one to Michael van Gerwen, who at that point was the world #1 and possibly the most dominant player on the planet. Read that list back: Rob Cross, Gary Anderson, Michael van Gerwen, beating a reigning world champion and reaching a major final by his early 20s, sharing finals with the very best in the world. This was a player who looked like the genuine next big thing in the sport. He'd signed with Target, one of the biggest manufacturers in darts. He had a signature range, he had the walk-on, he had the nickname. Everything was in place. None of that mattered for long, because it started falling apart soon after, and the way it fell apart is the part of this story that actually matters. Visa problems began restricting his ability to travel to Europe later in 2018, and here's why that's so much bigger than it sounds. The PDC Tour is built around Europe. The bulk of the events, the ranking money, the qualifiers, they all happen there, week after week after week, and a player based in Australia has to fly across the world constantly just to compete on equal footing with someone who lives an hour from the venue. When the visa issues hit, the damage was immediate, and Cadby failed to qualify for the 2019 World Championship. Imagine the isolation of that. You're one of the most talented players in the world, you're stuck on the wrong continent, watching the tour you fought to join carry on without you. April 2019 brought an attempt to rebuild momentum, a second PDC Development Tour title, and his first European Tour event in Prague, where he reached the last 16, so the ability was clearly still there. But the problem was that momentum didn't hold. By the middle of 2019, things were unraveling fast. A poor run through the Australian World Series events, a withdrawal from at least one tournament where he openly cited a lack of motivation and visible public friction between him and his manager playing out where everyone could see it. This is where the story stops being about darts and starts being about a person struggling. The withdrawals, the lost motivation, the public disputes, those aren't the actions of someone who's simply out of form. Those are warning signs. Early 2020, still ranked inside the world's top 64, still officially one of the best players in the world on paper, Cadby voluntarily gave up his PDC Tour card. Let that sink in. He didn't lose it, he handed it back while ranked among the elite. He also pulled out of a World Series event in New Zealand, something he'd later call one of his real regrets. A player at the peak of his ability walking away from the thing he was best at in the world. That doesn't happen because of darts. It happens because of everything around the darts. May 2020, deep into pandemic lockdown, Cadby sat down for a genuinely raw interview with Phil Bars. And this is where the real story behind the decline comes out. Not from commentators, not from speculation, but in his own words. Each day was so hard, and that led to obviously alcohol, he admitted. I was never happy, not one bit happy. I was actually depressed every day. The picture he painted was of someone whose outward success had nothing to do with his inner reality. A young man traveling the world to play a game while quietly falling apart. He went further than that too, describing exactly how dark things had gotten, and these are difficult words to hear. I didn't want to wake up, to be honest. There was thoughts of suicide actually on my mind at that time. That's not a slump. That's a person in genuine crisis, and it reframes everything about the withdrawals and the walkaways that came before it. He owned the fallout as well, refusing to make excuses, telling Bars, I did let a lot of people down at the time, and I'm totally ashamed of that. But the interview closed on defiance, not despair. They all say I'm done. I'm nowhere near done. The king is back. And for a moment, it looked like he might mean it. That comeback never fully landed back on tour, and the way it failed is almost harder to watch than an outright collapse would have been. January 2023, Cadby returned to Q School and won another tour card, reportedly with strong averages in the low hundreds, including a win over Karel Sedlacek, numbers that tell you the talent was still very much intact. The king had earned his place back. And here's where it gets strange, almost inexplicable, because despite regaining that card, despite doing the hard work to qualify all over again, he didn't play a single PDC event the entire year. Not one. The card he'd fought back to win just sat there, unused. January 2024 was the inevitable result. The PDC pulled his tour card again under their 12-month inactivity rule, and he hasn't competed professionally since. 2 comebacks, 2 tour cards regained through pure ability, and both times something outside the game pulled him back down. Now for the part of the story that's most recent, and also the part where we have to be most careful about what's actually confirmed versus what's coming from darts commentary channels rather than primary news outlets. I'm going to tell you what's been reported, and I'm going to be honest with you about the limits of that reporting, because that's the responsible way to handle it when we're talking about a real person and a real criminal case. December 2022, according to multiple darts recap channels covering the story, Cadby was involved in an incident at the home of a relative in Tasmania, one in which the homeowner suffered serious injuries. That was the beginning of a legal process that would take years to resolve. Those same channels report that a jury in the Supreme Court of Tasmania in December 2025 reached its verdict, finding Cadby guilty of aggravated burglary, and this distinction matters enormously, not guilty of assault. The reported reasoning was that jurors simply couldn't be certain he was the one responsible for the injuries themselves. He was reportedly sentenced later that month to a prison term, but one that was backdated far enough that he'd effectively already served the time while the case worked its way through the system, which meant that by the time the sentence was handed down, he walked free. I need to be completely straight with you about that section. This part comes from secondary reporting, darts community channels covering the case, rather than anything verified directly against primary Tasmanian court documents or major news outlets. We want that distinction crystal clear rather than dressing it up as settled fact. The broad strokes do line up across multiple independent sources, which is why it's worth reporting at all, but flagging exactly where the certainty ends is the only honest way to cover something this serious about a living person. If you take one thing from this section, let it be that the guilty verdict on burglary and the not guilty verdict on assault are reported as 2 separate things, and conflating them would be unfair to him. What does seem clear is where things stand today, and it's a long way from Alexandra Palace. No PDC tour card since January 2024, no professional matches since 2019. The visa complications that already made travel to European events difficult would only get harder layered on top of a criminal record, and that combination makes a return to the top level of the sport look genuinely remote. Some reports suggest he still wants back in, that the fire to compete hasn't gone out, and his 2023 Q school numbers, those low 100 averages, prove the ability itself never left him. But wanting it and the path, being open are 2 very different things, and realistically, climbing back from where he is now would be one of the steepest comebacks the sport has ever seen. So step back and look at the whole arc, because it's genuinely one of the most dramatic rise and fall stories in modern darts. A teenager from Tasmania picked up the sport at 16, beat Phil Taylor within a few short years of taking it seriously, became world youth champion, took down a reigning world champion in Rob Cross, reached a UK Open final, and shared major finals with Van Gerwen and Anderson, all before most people had even settled into their careers. Then visa problems, isolation, alcohol, and the depression he described in his own devastating words pulled him away from the tour he'd fought so hard to reach. 2 comebacks flickered and faded, and years later, he's dealing with the fallout of a serious legal case that most darts fans never even heard about. Corey Cadby's story is a reminder that behind every highlight reel and every next big thing narrative in this sport, there's a person carrying pressures the cameras never show. Pressures that don't disappear just because someone can throw a perfect 9-darter. He had the talent to be one of the all-time greats. What he didn't have was the support, the stability, or perhaps the circumstances to protect it. Whether he ever picks up a dart competitively again is genuinely uncertain, and it's fair to say that odds are against it. What isn't uncertain is that, for one brief blazing stretch, Corey Cadby was one of the most exciting young talents this sport had ever produced, and that's exactly what makes his story so hard to look away from.